Jesus is Lord, my Redeemer. Ah, he loves me, how I love him.
Just like many ancient travelers, we left Ephesus, traveled about 35 miles north along the Aegean Sea, and we're now in Smyrna. Smyrna is the second of the 7 churches of Asia. In New Testament times, it was a large city, estimated population more than 100,000, and a beautiful city. One ancient writer said that it might be the most beautiful city in the world. But unfortunately, much of that ancient magnificence cannot be seen today. The reason? Ancient Smyrna now lies buried under one of the largest cities in Turkey. Izmir is a seaport city with a population of nearly 2 million. In ancient times, Smyrna was guarded by a fort on a hill overlooking the city, and we have a panoramic view of Izmir and the Aegean Sea from this fortress. If an ancient traveler had been wanting to visit the 7 cities of Asia, he would have begun at Ephesus. From Ephesus, the natural route of travel was to follow the Roman roads north to Smyrna, then to Pergamum. It's about 100 miles from Ephesus to Pergamum. The traveler would then have turned southeastward to Thyatira and Sardis, then Philadelphia and Laodicea, a distance of 150 miles. From Laodicea back to Ephesus and the triangle was complete. Look at Revelation 2 and 3, and this is the same order John followed in writing to the 7 churches. We can see from the map that the Aegean Sea was very important to Smyrna and the other churches of Asia. These cities were first settled by colonists that crossed the Aegean Sea from Greece many centuries before Christ, and they remained Greek cities in language and culture. Ephesus and Smyrna were seaports on the Aegean, and in New Testament times, the cities stood on trade routes that connected the Aegean countries with the east.
This is Izmir, my hometown. I'm very proud that I was born here because this is also the city of Homeros and Polycarp, such well-known important men. Unfortunately, I cannot show you so many of the Roman or Hellenistic city of Smyrna because the modern city has grown on the ruins of these historical sites.
Archaeologists can't tear down modern buildings to get to the ancient city, so the Agora is the only site from New Testament times that can still be seen today. This is the state Agora of Smyrna, where the business of the city was transacted. But this is not the Agora that was there in John's day. We know that the city was destroyed by an earthquake probably in 177 AD. The emperor at that time was Marcus Aurelius. He knew what a beautiful city Smyrna was, and the records say that he wept when he heard of its destruction and gave a 10-year remission of taxes so that the city could be rebuilt. So that everything that we see here now, the beautiful columns, the subterranean vaults, all of this comes from the late 2nd century. The state agora in a Greek city was where the governmental affairs were carried on. This agora had a large courtyard nearly 400 feet long and surrounded by columns. Some of the columns are still standing. The stoa around the agora was 3 stories high. It had the colonnaded portico that was 2 stories high, and this was built over a vaulted basement.
This part, the northern part of the agora, you see behind me, was in the form of a basilica, as we can see from the columns in the middle.
Smyrna was truly a beautiful city, as these columns show. The marble beams resting on top of the columns are called the architrave. All the public buildings had beautiful carvings, as we can see from the marble fragments scattered around the site. It's not surprising that the Emperor Marcus Aurelius called Smyrna the glory of Asia.
Altogether, it's one of the biggest agoras that we have now preserved in the country.
Here's a column lying on the ground that is interesting because the fluting was never finished. The stonemasons cut the fluting after the columns were standing, and this one must have fallen before it was finished, but it shows how the masons did their work. There was a large basement under much of the agora, and the basement rooms had vaulted ceilings. The Romans knew how to build arches, and these arches supported the weight of the tall columns of the agora above them. After 2,000 years of earthquakes, the vaulted ceilings are still intact, and we can see the skill of the stonemasons even in these underground rooms. Except for this state agora, all the other public buildings of Smyrna lie buried under the modern city. We know that Smyrna had many temples to the Greek gods. The largest was a temple of Zeus that overlooked the Aegean Sea. Smyrna also had a large stadium and a theater that seated 20,000 people. And the city had a statue of its most illustrious son, the poet Homer, who was born here about 800 BC. But with a modern city covering these ancient buildings, we don't even know where they were. When the Lord wrote to the church here, he warned them that they faced tribulations, and one of these was emperor worship. About 60 years before Revelation was written, the Romans decided to choose one city in Asia to be the temple keeper where the emperor would be worshipped. 11 cities competed for the honor, but Smyrna was chosen and built the first temple for the emperor in Asia. Ancient coins have pictures of this temple, and one that was built to Hadrian later. Ian, we know that all the 7 churches faced the danger of persecution, and the letter to Smyrna talks about tribulation. One of the most famous martyrdoms in early church history happened right here. Tell us about it.
This was the martyrdom of Polycarp at about 155 AD, where Polycarp was brought before the proconsul Quadratus and said, 86 years have I served him, and never once has he harmed me. How can I now blaspheme my king and savior? Because of his refusal to worship Caesar, Polycarp and others were martyred here in Smyrna.
Polycarp was burned at the stake in the stadium. It was a public spectacle. But this trial before Quadratus may have been held here in the Agora. Polycarp had been a student of the Apostle John, and when he died in the flames, one of the last of John's disciples was gone.
And a remarkable part of that is the role played with the Jews. The records say that they helped to bring the wood, to build the fire, even though it was the Sabbath day when it happened.
The Lord's letter to Smyrna shows the hostility between the Christians and the Jews. Jesus said, I know the slander of those who say they are Jews but are a synagogue of Satan. So I guess it's not surprising that the Jews would help burn Polycarp to death.
It's hard to walk around this Agora without thinking of Polycarp and the other Christians who died here for their faith. The marble lion is a reminder that believers died in many ways. Sometimes they were thrown into the arena to fight the wild beasts. The Christians that faced these dangers needed strength and encouragement, and they found it in the Lord's letter. It's the shortest of the 7 letters, and it has only praise and comfort, no rebukes.
The letter to Smyrna is the second letter of Jesus to the 7 churches of Asia. It is one of 2 letters that is positive and has no negative condemnation of the church. The other one is to Philadelphia. This is a beautiful little letter. It's very short, indicates that the church is going to go through a very severe period of testing and persecution and suffering. But it encourages the church, if you are faithful unto death, you will receive the crown of life. What this means, if you're willing to die for Jesus, you will live and reign with Jesus.
The message from Smyrna is that faithfulness to Jesus is more powerful than even the reality of suffering and death. Our victory is guaranteed by the resurrection of Jesus and our faithfulness to him, even in the face of death. There is another message. The Christians in Smyrna were poor. Jesus said, I know your poverty, yet you are rich. Whenever the church is poor in spirit, as Jesus said in one of the Beatitudes, when it knows its need for God, then it is rich, just like Smyrna.
Jesus is Lord, my Redeemer.
We have now arrived at Thyatira, an inland town about 60 miles northeast of Smyrna. I remember that one of Paul's first converts on the continent of Europe was Lydia, a seller of purple from Thyatira. Our visit here may be a little disappointing because there's not much to be seen of that ancient New Testament city, even less than at Smyrna. And the reason is the same. This town lies buried under the modern Turkish town of Akhisar. One small area right in the middle of Akhisar has been excavated, and the archaeologists have found the ruins of only 2 interesting buildings, a temple of Apollo and a church built in honor of John.
These ruins are from the temple of Apollo all around us. Now, Apollo was worshipped here for a long time, but we don't know what the temple was like because on the site later many buildings were constructed Also, the Church of St. John was constructed here at the 6th century AD.
None of the walls or columns of the Temple of Apollo are still standing, but many column drums and marble fragments are scattered around, and these show that it was an important temple. The archaeologists found arches that had fallen, but instead of restoring them, they have laid them out on the ground. Here's a row of column bases that are still in place on the stylobot. Stylobot is an archaeological term, and it refers to the massive blocks of cut stone that were laid end to end as a foundation for a row of columns. The god Apollo was worshipped in many cities. His most famous temple was at Delphi in Greece, and the people came from all over the world to seek the oracle's advice. The oracle also spoke at the great temple at Didyma, south of Ephesus, that we have already visited.
Apollo is the sun god, actually, but being the sun god, for example, nothing is a secret to him because he can see everything from above. And he is responsible for the oracles, he is responsible for the medical treatment of everybody.
Along with the Temple of Apollo, the archaeologists have found an ancient church. It was built in the 6th century in honor of John. The walls, constructed of brick and stone, are still standing. As we move around the nave, we can see that this was an impressive church building, not as large as Justinian's church at Ephesus, but still impressive for a smaller town like Thyatira. Arched doorways led from the main part of the church into the rooms along the side. This church, like the others that we see in the 7 cities of Asia, was built about 200 years after the Roman persecutions had ended. They show that the Christian faith was very strong in Asia up to the time that the Muslims came in the 7th century. The New Testament has only 2 references to Thyatira, the home of Lydia in Acts 16 and the letter here in Revelation, but we have many other sources of information about the city. We know that trade guilds were very important here, and these guilds were the basis for the city's prosperity. We learned from inscriptions that there were trade guilds for potters and bakers, for wool merchants, for metal workers, even for slave traders. The city was famous for dyeing purple cloth, and this may explain why Lydia, whose home was here, was a seller of purple in Philippi. In the Lord's letter, he referred to himself as the one whose feet were like burnished bronze. The Greek word for burnished bronze has not been found anywhere else, and this may be a reference to the guild for metal workers here in Thyatira. These trade guilds posed some very serious problems for the Christians who lived here. If a Christian was going to work in a guild, he might be forced to go along with all of its activities, including immoral fertility rites and even sacrifices to pagan gods. But if he refused to go along with the guild's activities, he might be without a job. As the church struggled with this problem, some of them favored compromise. They said that even though Jesus was their Lord, still it would be all right to go along with the pagan sacrifices. This party was led by a woman called Jezebel, and she comes in for some of the strongest criticism anywhere in Revelation. Thyatira was the least important of the 7 cities, but the letter to the church here was the longest. Why did the Lord have so much to say to this church?
The letter to Thyatira is interesting because it has a mixed message. Jesus begins by praising the church and commending the church for their love and their faith and their service and patient endurance and the fact that their later works are better than their first works. The central problem in Revelation was one of compromising one's faith. In this letter to Thyatira, Jesus condemns the church there for tolerating a Jezebel-type woman who taught the church to compromise their faith by committing adultery and eating food offered to idols.
Christians today can learn much from this church. The Church of Jesus cannot afford to compromise its faith with a secular mind and sensual immorality. Jesus tells us that his eyes are like a flaming fire. He can see through our insincerity and the spiritual veneer that we sometimes hide behind. When we are tempted to go along with our immoral culture, we must renew our faith in Jesus and his moral standards. For if we vacillate and compromise, then we deny him.
Jesus is Lord, my Redeemer.
Philadelphia was about 80 miles east of Smyrna. It was located in a wide valley where the volcanic soil was very fertile, and today the finest grapes in Turkey are grown in this region. Philadelphia was the youngest of the 7 cities of Asia. King Attalus of Pergamum built the city about 150 B.C. Attalus was so devoted to one of his brothers that he was given the title Philadelphus, the one that loves his brother, and that title became the name of his new city. Like Smyrna and Thyatira, Philadelphia is buried under a modern city, and as a result there are fewer antiquities here at Philadelphia than any of the other churches. There's an ancient church honoring John, but that's all. Everything else, including a stadium and theater, are somewhere under the modern buildings of Alashir. The Church of John was built around A.D. 600. Archaeologists are currently doing a little work around the church. They found some of the foundations and walls of earlier buildings that stood on this site before the church was built, but they have not learned what these earlier buildings were. Archaeologists work in squares, usually 5 meters on a side, and here's a square near the wall of John's church. They found a piece of marble in the wall of the square, and it's still there. A column with unusual spiral fluting lies on the bottom of the square. Here and there, fragments of carved marble give us a glimpse of Philadelphia's beauty. The massive walls and arches of the Church of St. John that are still standing show that it was a very large building, much larger than the church at Thyatira. We have now visited 4 of the 7 cities of Asia, and 3 of these have had Byzantine churches built in honor of John. Justinian's great church in Ephesus, then Thyatira, now Philadelphia. It may seem a little strange that all these churches honored John and not Paul. While Paul was at Ephesus, his converts had planted many of these churches. But centuries later, when the churches were free to erect buildings, it was John they chose to honor. John had lived at Ephesus and was buried there. As an old man, he had admonished the church to love one another. And Jesus had chosen John on Patmos to write what you see and send it to the 7 churches. So the churches remembered and honored John. Judging from the Lord's letter to Philadelphia, this must have been the very best of the 7 churches, for Jesus had only praise for them, not a word of rebuke, not one. The church here had kept his word, they had not denied his name, and they had endured patiently. Because of their faithfulness, the Lord had set before them an open door of opportunity for evangelism and for witnessing. And because the church here had kept his word, he promised to keep them from the hour of trial that was coming on the whole earth. There were other promises as well. They would be a pillar in the temple of God, and they would wear Jesus' own new name. Compare these beautiful promises with the Lord's threat to the church in Ephesus. He warned them that unless they repented, he would remove their lampstand out of its place. It took several centuries for this to happen, but when the armies of Islam swept across Asia in the 7th century, Ephesus and the other cities fell, and the Christian faith withered and died. But not in Philadelphia. The city here was the last bastion of the Christian faith in Asia. Long after the other cities fell, Philadelphia remained a free Christian city in the midst of a Muslim world. The church was still enjoying the Lord's promises. But finally, Philadelphia fell in 1391. And today in Asia, where the church was once stronger than anywhere else in the world, the churches lie in ruins and the minarets are everywhere. Sadly, all the 7 lampstands are gone.